Over time, the environmental movement itself lost its nerve, lost its ability to talk about population. 50 years ago, there was a consensus in the United States and in many parts of the world on the need to stabilize population to create sustainable societies.
The IPAT formula was developed in the early 1970s. That came out of, or that was part of the emerging modern environmental movement. Was it embraced at a larger scale? What was the environmental movement's relationship to the formula, and how did it spread out from there?
When IPAT was first introduced, it was encapsulating the common sense of the environmental movement at the time. Environmentalists, for the most part, understood that human numbers were a fundamental part of environmental impacts. They understood that commitment to limiting consumption was important. And then they had an attention to appropriate technology as well. And it wasn't just the marchers, it wasn't just the speakers at Earth Day. President Nixon talked about the need to stabilize U.S. population. In fact, he set up a commission to look at population issues, and they came back with a report which said, we see no value in increasing the U.S. population and considerable problems with continuing to do so. So IPAT was really the common sense of the time. Now, in subsequent decades, the environmental movement, especially the American environmental movement, moved away from that. And I think the reasons for that were complex, but one of the most important was the movement kind of got complacent. And just as the larger society was sort of embracing neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, the environmental movement got to a point where they were no longer willing to criticize the economic status quo. So you couldn't question people's desire for more and more consumption. Instead, you looked for win-win solutions of one kind or another. The other thing that happened was, at the dawn of the environmental movement in the United States, most of our population growth was coming from relatively high fertility levels in the United States, the baby boom and the aftermath of the baby boom. But in the decades that followed, as American fertility levels went low and stayed low, immigration increased.
There was a fight about this inside the environmental movement.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely. At some point, the environmental movement had to make a decision. Were we going to talk explicitly about the need to reduce immigration? Many people argued for that, but other people weren't comfortable with it. And so within the Sierra Club, within the Audubon Society, within Zero Population Growth, all of these groups had big fights about whether to take on immigration at the level it needed to be taken on. And one by one, they decided they didn't want to do that.
People turned away from the issue because it brought up another issue, immigration, that they didn't want to touch. And then they reasoned backwards to support that position.
They reasoned backwards from that position and came up with after-the-fact arguments for why population really wasn't that important to pollution, sprawl, carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the scientists tell us that these things, population is important to all these impacts.
So are you saying that the environmental movement of today, if they were to embrace the formula at all, would embrace an I equals at formula?
They might embrace an I equal at formula, leaving all the population out of it, but they don't really push too hard on the A part of that either.
That's the affluence.
The affluence, the consumption. Every once in a while, you get a little bit of worries that maybe Americans are consuming at too high a level, but there's not a lot of strong push for us to consume less. So basically what you're left with is this rump movement, which simply is trying to solve all of our problems with technology or managerial fixes.